Where did this all start, right? And a lot of people blame money, right? Money and positional power within a conference, correct, is largely what is at the crux of all this. And that's also how all of this started, in my opinion, right?
Deep in the heart of Texas.
We're in the business of winning.
Don't bet against me.
I don't bet anyway.
Lose your life.
Let's talk a little more college football. Obviously, there's been some big movements in the Big 12, SEC, Pac-12, Big 10, really all across the board. Some people like it, some people don't. Some people are upset, some people see it as inevitable. But my thought on this is, where did this all start, right? And a lot of people blame money, right? Money and positional power within a conference, correct, is largely what is at the crux of all this. And that's also how all of this started, in my opinion, right? And, of course, being an Aggie fan, and my other friend who runs the channel here is a Longhorn fan, right? You probably can already guess where I'm going with this. But in my opinion, this largely all started when Texas took the TV deal, correct? And even a few years before that, right? There were rumblings within the Big 12 that, you know, obviously Oklahoma and Texas were getting a lot of favoritism and essentially was kind of creating an unfair landscape within the conference, right? And so let me just address the Longhorn fans first and their arguments, right? Sometimes what they say is like, well, if you could have done that, wouldn't you have done it, right? Maybe yes and maybe no, but it's a little different, right? In terms of this, right? Texas is a college football powerhouse, right? There's no denying that. And at this time, they were crushing it. Oklahoma was doing really well also, which is largely why Nebraska left. But also, if you remember, Missouri, Colorado, and A&M and Nebraska all left like within a year or two of each other. And, you know, this largely started with the fact that Oklahoma and Texas were getting a lot of favoritism. And remember, they don't do revenue sharing in the Big 12, right? So keep that in mind. And so a lot of people will say, well, like Texas deserved it, or Texas was able to do it, they should do it. Yes and no, right? This goes back to my video I put out, Saturday or Sunday, a day or two ago, about how you should in a way be rooting for teams within your conference or your rivals, because having better teams or playing more winning teams is better for your school at the end of the day. Win or lose, right? You want to play better teams. That's just the way it is. At the end of the day, you want your team to be successful. If you beat a bunch of tomato cans, it doesn't really count, right? It's not the same. You want the teams in your conference to be good, right? And that kind of goes with what I sort of use as a rebuttal to Texas. That's fine if you want to take the TV deal, right? The Longhorn Network. It's not so much that people hate on you because they felt you didn't deserve it or something of that nature. The thing is that when you did that, right, you kind of snubbed the other teams in your conference. Again, there is an other side to the coin, right? You have to acknowledge the other side of the coin, that if you're going to do this and you're going to have this big advantage, right, and the advantage largely is that you get to go into recruits' homes and you get to say you're going to be on your own network essentially 24/7, right? I mean, let's admit it's largely for men's sports or basketball and football mainly, right? Baseball, a little bit of other things sprinkled here and there. But it's largely football, and then a faraway second is basketball and other sports. You get to walk into recruits' homes and say, you essentially are going to be on TV 24/7, right? You're going to be on your own network in terms of the Longhorn Network, which is a deal through ESPN. And you have to at least acknowledge that if you are another team within the Big 12, right, that is, you do so well within this conference. You largely kind of have to play some team ball here with your other conference peers, correct? And, nobody lost more or nobody was snubbed more in that deal than A&M, right? You're kind of putting money before the legacy. You're putting money before the rivalry, correct? In a way, right? And again, it's not so much that we don't think you didn't deserve it, but there are consequences to actions, right? And I would respect Texas fans a lot more if they just said, well, we didn't care. Like, we're going to take the deal and we don't care what happens. Okay, fine. I can respect that answer more than, and it'd be one thing if it was like, hey, we're going to take this deal and we understand people might be mad. But they don't even really acknowledge that, right? There is another side to the coin. If you are A&M or Missouri, Colorado, Nebraska, and the landscape is just shifted in such a way that you're at a huge disadvantage, and all you do is just look over at the other side geographically, right? For Nebraska, the Big Ten's right across, the other state line, and for A&M, the SEC's right over the other state line to Louisiana going east, right? And they're saying, hey, we split revenue here. Like, hey, you'll get a fair shake, right? Along with everyone else. How do you not? You have to understand that by doing that, you are forcing the hand of other teams within your conference, right? And so that's why I never really understood. Like, they did that deal, and then people wanted to blame A&M or Missouri and things of that nature, and being like, why didn't you just accept it? It's like, I understand that in terms of on paper, in terms of like versus each other in terms of records, A&M is second fiddle. But as a program, as a university, right, A&M can do whatever they want, right? They have enough money and funds and pull and a big enough footprint to do what they want, correct? And so that's why I never got Longhorn fans who like didn't understand it. Like they were acting like we killed the rivalry, correct? And they don't acknowledge that what they did forced our hand as well as others, correct? And people act like the schools that A&M and the other schools left because they sucked, right? Like, as if, previously in history they hadn't sucked and yet they had never left. Or that, Nebraska was going to go to the Big Ten and all of a sudden be good. Or that A&M was going to go to the SEC and all of a sudden be good. If anything, A&M was supposed to do worse in the SEC. They took a huge risk by going to the SEC, right? And I just don't get this inability to acknowledge that there was another step to fall, right? Another choice to be made, a counter choice in terms of what people were going to do after them. After they made that deal with the Longhorn Network, you have to understand, like, teams are not just going to take that, correct? And I just don't understand the whole viewpoint that A&M left because they were scared or that we killed the rivalry, correct? Without acknowledging what they did, And it's not so much that Texas, like, didn't deserve it or they weren't good enough for it. That's not the argument. The argument is that you're kind of thumbing your nose at everyone else in the conference, A&M especially, your biggest rival, right? And you're sort of taking them for granted. And you're sort of just saying, well, all we want is the money and the exposure, right? And in my opinion, that choice, taking the network deal and the money and the exposure over the considerations of the other teams in your conference, is what has led to all of this, correct? And that's where it ties back into everyone agrees that these moves are for money and exposure and conference standings, or a little bit of gamesmanship and chess moves in terms of going to bigger and better conferences, perhaps more revenue, perhaps a better ranking, more exposure, etc., right? And people are saying, well, that's what's kind of ruining college football. You might like this, right? So I think a lot of people, it's probably pretty close to a coin flip of people who don't care or are indifferent or like it versus people who don't like it, right? They like the traditions, again, the rivalries, the traditions, the teams you've played for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years. A lot of that's being changed and shaken up. And, that obviously can leave a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. I've definitely missed playing Texas, but we had, A&M kind of had to stand their ground and say we made a choice, we have to stick by it, right? And that's why I never got Texas fans were like, why don't you play us? And it's like, you forced our hand to do something. We cannot run right back. If we run right back, then it was all for nothing in a way. And the fact that we get to play LSU on Thanksgiving and you guys have to play Kansas State or Texas Tech, right? We understand why you want to play us, especially after seeing how well we've done relatively in the SEC since we've gone there. I understand why you would want to play us, but we kind of have to make you stew in it for a while, correct? We kind of have to make you eat your words or live by the choices that you make, and we can't just run back to you, right? We made a move, and we kind of have to have a spine about it, and we kind of have to stand by it. And so with Texas doing that, right, you are straight lying through your teeth if you tell me that the Big 12 has been the same or better since those teams left, or that it's been as fun or as competitive. It definitely hasn't. And the proof is in the pudding that if the Big 12 was doing just as well, then Oklahoma and Texas wouldn't be moving to the SEC, right? They just simply wouldn't. If they were still being able to dominate, or if the Big 12 was still seen as competitive as it was, they just simply would not be coming to the SEC, right? It literally makes no sense from OU's and Texas' point of view is that if the Big 12 was doing just as well or better, then they would just stay there and dominate. They're easily the best two teams. You get to run through your conference perhaps, and you'll get a college football playoff spot. But the Big 12 has been so bad, and the money probably has been just flying out the window in terms of loss of revenue and money going down and things of that nature, that I'm sure that, they had to come to the SEC. They had to leave the Big 12. Or else they just wouldn't do it, right? It just makes no sense otherwise. With A&M and the three other schools leaving the Big 12, the Big 12 now is not as good. It just isn't. And when we take a look over at, the Pac-12 and the ACC and the Big 12, right? Essentially, the Big 10 is not as good as the SEC, but they still have much more competitive blue bloods within that program, correct? And teams like the Pac-12 and the ACC and the Big 12 are kind of crumbling, right? They're just not as competitive. They don't get as many eyeballs. You cannot recruit as well compared to maybe like a Big 10 or an SEC school that you get to say, hey, we get to play Georgia, Bama, LSU, and a whole host of other teams that are usually pretty good year in, year out. You get to play against those guys or with those guys versus if you go to Oregon, I'm not quite sure what the selling point is there for Oregon really anymore, right? What's the selling point for Texas? You get to play Oklahoma once a year. That's the selling point for Texas now, right, in terms of recruiting. And going back just a little bit why I think the deal ended up hurting Texas is you take A&M, right? A&M's your biggest in-state competition in terms of recruiting. They get to go to the SEC, and they now get to walk into living rooms and pitch that to kids. We're going to play Bama every year. We're going to play LSU every year. We're going to play Auburn, maybe Georgia and Florida here and there, etc., right? They get to walk in and pitch that to kids, and that is a much bigger selling point than Texas saying we get to play Oklahoma once a year. And that's probably the only big game that we can guarantee you, right? And Texas or A&M's getting to pitch 3, 4, maybe 5 big games a year that are going to be televised, that are going to have huge implications in rankings. And Texas can't quite do that anymore, right? And, if you've looked at recruiting, A&M has made leaps and bounds in recruiting compared to Texas since they left, right? And it all starts with recruiting. College football, largely, in my opinion, is like 75 to 90% recruiting. It just is. You have to have the horses, you have to have the talent, and it all starts with recruiting, right? And, Texas, obviously, since A&M has left, Texas and A&M have largely been eye to eye in many ways, right? I think Texas has had A&M's had some slightly bigger peaks, a slightly better finish, I think, 2 years ago. Manziel winning the Heisman. I just think they've had, they've largely been the same, which, again, if we were to go back before A&M left the Big 12 and people were to tell you A&M will be as good as Texas on paper and in rankings and finishes and all that, people would think you were crazy, right? If you were to tell them that with A&M going to the SEC. That's largely what it's been, right? They've really been neck and neck on a lot of things with A&M, getting, edging out Texas on a few things as well. And so, I think overall the deal has been a lot of karma for Texas. What they thought they were getting in money and exposure ended up to a soft conference, a crumbling conference, because people left. Again, why would a middle tier school or even maybe like a tier 2 school want to go to the Big 12 to replace these other teams when you have a network deal? The Big 12 doesn't share revenue. You know what I mean? It's kind of one of those things where I don't think Texas saw the forest from the trees in terms of what they were doing. And it came back to bite them in the butt largely. I think largely it did. Imagine if A&M had the Manziel era in the Big 12. That's some big time football between A&M and Texas, right? The rivalry's definitely kicked up a notch. A&M's been much better as of late, right? And who knows if that would have happened had we stayed in the Big 12, right? But let's just say the Texas A&M does as well as they've had the last 10 years or so since we left. And, we play Texas and beat them half the time, or maybe even over 500% the last 10 years, right? It's a whole different landscape for the Big 12 now, right? And Missouri was good for a while there, and the SEC as well. I mean, we're talking about a completely different landscape of college football, but that deal drove a lot of teams out of the Big 12. It just did. You've sort of forced their hand. And from that, right, the Big 12 has largely caved in on itself. It's not the same. That forces Oklahoma and Texas to go to the SEC, which just geographically makes sense, right? And, from that, you have these other domino effect, this other cascading of moves by other teams because they have to kind of jockey for position in a better conference, right? The ACC is not what it was. Clemson's had a few down years. Florida State and Miami have not been historically what they are. And you look at the Pac-12, USC and Oregon, largely those two teams, right? Why stay in the Pac-12? There's just really no point. So they make their moves as well. And we have this whole shifting of college teams going on in conferences, right? To me, the crux of this issue, or where it started, right? When we look back, I think it's the Longhorns taking the network, the ESPN network deal. I really do. In my opinion, that's what kind of started the first domino of teams packing up and moving, right? The Big 12 at the time when that happened was a good conference. Like, it was a solid conference. Again, SEC was still probably better at the time. But Texas and Oklahoma heading the Big 12 with the other teams that they had could go against any other conference besides maybe the SEC, right? I would say they were on the level of an Ohio State and a Michigan, right? Big 10 and Big 12, I think in my opinion, were kind of neck and neck at the time. So, Big 12's jockeying for the second best conference almost every year, right? And we're talking about the South. The best talent comes out of Texas. That's just what it is, right? And, you have like this hotbed of abilities and players to recruit to these Big 12 teams. And A&M leaves. They drag some of that with them, as well as Missouri, Colorado, Nebraska, right? And players don't want to play in the Big 12 with only one big game a year. The Big 12, essentially, in my opinion, was the second or third best conference year in and year out, right? They just were. Ohio State would have something to say about that. But if you remember, Michigan wasn't very good until the last 5 years or so, right? 5+ years. And Oklahoma and Texas were still perennial contenders every year. A&M would pop up every so often. Baylor had caught some traction as well. Texas Tech sometimes will pop in there. And so minus the SEC, right? The Big 12, I think, on average, was the second best conference almost year in and year out. But again, they force the hand of these other teams. I think they take their conference for granted. They take these other teams for granted. And, I know I'm an Aggie, I'm a homer, but I think A&M deserves a lot of credit for sacking up, taking a risk, doing what they needed to do when they felt, unappreciated and disrespected by their rival. And this goes back, like, you can't just simply hate your rivals, right? You have to have somewhat of a respect for your rivals, if you know what I mean. And Texas didn't do that, and A&M had a tough choice to make, and they said, we're not going to be disrespected like this. You've kind of gone too far, and we're leaving, right? And the SEC welcomed them with open arms, as they should have. They're, I know we have underachieved in sports and whatnot, but A&M is a great university, a huge university, a massive footprint. The SEC gets a big-time Texas school in its ranks. It just made all the sense to go to the SEC. And a lot of teams we've kind of already had a relationship with and a history with, right? And, they forced them to do this, and the Big 12 caves in on itself, and it starts this whole cascading of moves by other teams. And that's just mainly the summary of my video is, for everyone who's complaining about, I hate this move, I hate that all this is happening, in my opinion, right, this all goes back to the Longhorn Network. It really does. That's essentially the summary of my video. Texas made schools leave the conference, and that made the Big 12 collapse, and that made Nebraska go to the Big 10. That then made other schools realize that the ACC and the Big 12 and the Pac-12 are not going to be able to keep up. They're just simply not going to be able to keep up with the Big 10 and the SEC, and we got to do something, right? And we have to make a move. And everyone's kind of in a flurry now after Texas and OU went to the SEC, and everyone's like, we got to do something here, right? We got to make a move. We have to go join up with some other schools. We have to go somewhere with some sustainability, where the revenue's shared. We're going to get an equal shake. And we have to be in a conference that's seen as competitive, right? If you were to just let the SEC run wild with getting OU and Texas in there, right? I mean, you're looking at possibly, at a minimum, 2 schools are coming out of the SEC every year for the college football playoff. And now that we have 8, right, or it's going to 8, I mean, you have a good chance of 4 schools coming out of the SEC based on strength of schedule and, looking at who they played and beat and their record within the SEC compared to maybe 1 out of the Pac-12, maybe 1 out of the ACC, and maybe a couple out of the Big 10, right? And you have to look at that in terms of the long game, and you have to say we can't stay in these conferences. We have to go somewhere where, this is why I think A&M deserves a lot of credit for what they did. They took a huge risk going to tougher competition, but understood that in the long run, this is the only chance we'll have to perhaps be successful, right? Because if we stay here under the thumb of UT and the Longhorn Network and the absolutely, difference in amount of resources and exposure that we're getting compared. I mean, don't be wrong, there's teams like Oklahoma and stuff in the Big 12, but A&M is comparing itself to UT every year in terms of recruiting, exposure, TV contracts, or being on TV, and all this kind of stuff, right? Essentially, geographically speaking, right, they are right there. They are our rival. This is who we have to sort of be measuring how we're doing every year, right? And if they're going to do this deal, we're gonna stay under their thumb for the rest of time, right? Or until something changes. And instead of just sitting around and waiting for that change to happen, they sacked up. They went to the SEC. They took a big risk, and it paid off. Like they They have done better than anyone would have ever imagined when they left the Big 12. And anyone saying, even as Aggie fans, right? Anyone saying that they knew A&M would be that good, they are absolutely they're either lying or they're one in a million, right? Because no one thought A&M would be this good in the SEC, correct? They thought we'd be even worse than what we were in the Big 12. And so a lot of schools had to do the same kind of calculation and say, what are we going to do here? Are we going to stay in this crumbling, crappy conference, for lack of a better word, and maybe hopefully we'll win the conference one year and get in the playoff? Because you got to realize, like, if you're USC and Oregon, right, and maybe another team here or there in that conference, you're hoping you have to win your conference every year now to get into the playoff. Whereas if you go to the Big Ten, now you're maybe one of 4 really good blue bloods in that conference, and you maybe have like a 50% chance or a little higher to make it to the playoff depending on your record and how things shake out. You don't necessarily have to win your conference now, right? That's the thought I think that's going on here, is because of all this realignment. And when Texas and OU went to the SEC, again, because the Big 12 crumbled, because of what happened with the Longhorn Network and A&M and the other schools leaving, they looked at it and said, there's going to be 4 schools coming out of the SEC and 2 schools out of the Big 10. We have to make a move here, right? And I think playoff seeding has something to do with it. Again, exposure. Everyone's going to be watching the SEC now, or they're going to be watching Ohio State and Michigan. We have to do something here, right? And so that's largely what I think this is the genesis of it. Like, is the Longhorn Network and that shakeup that originally started with A&M and the 3 other schools leaving the Big 12. And it's all been a domino effect from there. So that's largely my video. That's my opinion. Let me know if you guys agree or don't agree. But I'll see you guys on the next one.